Well, our speaker this evening, speaking on the subject of Lord Chelmsford and his participation in the Anglo-Zulu Wars and his life leading up to that, um, is an acknowledged expert on the Anglo-Zulu Wars. He is a South African, but seems to have spent a lot of time in Canada teaching at Wilfrid Laurier University in Southern Ontario. Has published a number of books on his chosen period of African history. And also, very interestingly, just shortly before the anniversary, the centenary of the war, he and a colleague visited most, if not all, of the battlefield locations and mapped them out in an atlas, which is, I think, still available. He'll tell us that a bit about the case in a moment. But with no further ado, I'd like to welcome John Laband to give us his talk this evening. I'm going to leave the stage now, and then I will come back for the moderated Q&A session at the end. John, are you happy to go?
I'm happy to go. Well, good evening, everyone, wherever you might be. I'm in South Africa in a tiny village about 2 hours away from Cape Town, where I've finally retired after many years of lecturing and indeed many years acquaintance with Lord Chelmsford. In fact, I think I've been involved with him for something like 45 years by now. We first started off, I and my colleague Paul Thompson, working on really identifying all the sites of the Anglo-Zulu War, all 100 and something fortifications and so on, tons of field work, which we really enjoyed. But one went on from there with Chelmsford. I suppose I really got to know him when I edited for the Army Record Society, the Chelmsford papers, which so now I absolutely learned how to decipher Chelmsford writing and more or less to know what he's going to say before I'd actually read what he had written. He certainly had his patterns of writing, if you like. So I've carried on with a lot of work on Chelmsford. I suppose my biggest inspiration was a work which most of you won't know. It's a PhD and indeed a master's before that by Jeff Matthews on Chelmsford, which had really the most sort of comprehensive work on Chelmsford, I think, that I knew. But what I'm going to talk about tonight isn't so much Chelmsford as a general. I won't be looking at the Anglo-Zulu War campaign as such. I'll be looking at something else. I'll be looking at Chelmsford as a typical mid-Victorian aristocratic officer going forward through privilege and purchase and patronage, and seeing how, in fact, this made his career and, in fact, destroyed his career. That's actually what I'll be looking at. He certainly became well known at some stage. This is a cigarette coupon thing, this particular portrait of his. And in looking at Chelmsford in the way I'm going to, where I'm really going to be talking about the politics of command, I think I should mention Ian Beckett's book of a few years ago, A British Profession of Arms, which is about the politics of command. And that certainly for me was a great inspiration when I embarked on this particular study. Sorry, I'm just trying to get the slides to go here. Where is the... there we go. There we go. This is Chelmsford's father, a high Tory, an anti-Semite, very much against Catholic emancipation. And this was the environment Chelmsford grew up in. Now, the Thesages are quite interesting. They came to England, in fact, in the mid-18th century. Tasigers, there were Tasigers from the little kingdom of Saxony in Germany. The great-grandfather entered the service of Lord Rockingham, who was Prime Minister for a short period as his private secretary. His son, made much more of a fortune and bought sugar estates on St. Vincent and Trinidad, obviously a slave owner on these particular estates. But Chelmsford's father, whose picture is here, why in fact he didn't continue simply as a proprietor of a sugar estate is that the island of St. Vincent was absolutely devastated by a volcanic eruption. The estate was destroyed, and Thesiger had to find another career. And he found one, in fact, as a barrister. As a barrister, very successful one. He took silk. He became a Tory politician. He held various seats, and he held posts in various governments afterwards. So this is the environment that Chelmsford, our Chelmsford, who was born in 1827, grew up in. Young Chelmsford went to Eton College, educated there. And then what career to follow? Well, his father wanted him to go into the army, suitable for a gentleman. He wanted him to go into the Grenadier Guards and use his position as Solicitor General in Peel's second cabinet to make contact with the Duke of Wellington, who was at that stage Commander-in-Chief, to try and push forward this application. There was no room at that stage in the Guards, but Wellington used his position as Colonel of the Rifle Brigade to ensure that the young Chelmsford was able to buy lieutenancy by purchase in the Rifle Brigade. And that is where he began his career. And sorry, this is not working as it should. There we go. There we go. Right. He was stationed, in fact, in Halifax, in the Citadel in Halifax, where he enjoyed his time in Canada, but he wasn't there for very long at all, because his father at that stage, by now was Attorney General in Peel's administration, enabled him to exchange by purchase into the Grenadier Guards. So he went back after only a year in Halifax. He went back, in fact, to England, where he, there we are. There he joined the Grenadier Guards by purchase. And within 5 years, by purchase, he is promoted to lieutenant and captain in the Guards. And in London, of course, he led the life of a young Guards officer with all the luxury and social life involved. But his father, again, was now Attorney General in Lord Derby's first administration and pulled all the necessary strings. And Chelmsford found himself in 1852 as ADC to the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, the Earl of Eglinton of the famous tournament, of the tournament fame. So he finds himself in Ireland as ADC, where in fact he again is living a life in the castle as a young ADC, a very social, pleasant kind of life. At that stage, while the young Thesiger is in Dublin, the Duke of Wellington dies and is replaced as Commander-in-Chief by Field Marshal Viscount Harding. Now, Harding was very much a family friend of the Thesigers, and Thesiger himself wrote to his brother-in-law at a later stage, while Harding's there, he'll do anything my father asks him to. So here again, with this patronage, Thesiger soon found himself now as ADC to the Commander-in-Chief in Ireland, Lieutenant General Sir Edward Blakeney. So he's now doing very well in Ireland as ADC to the CIC, but we're now reaching the period when the Crimean War breaks out, and the young Thesiger is determined to get to the battlefront. And it's not long, in fact. It's in beginning of 1855 that he leaves Dublin and goes off to the Crimea. The thing, though, about his career there, and here's a picture of the Guards in the trenches before Sebastopol. Thesiger spent no time digging holes around Sebastopol, because almost immediately he was appointed as ADC to the General Officer Commanding of the 2nd Division, Major General Edwin Markham. So right from the beginning, he operated as a staff officer around Sebastopol. While he was there, he was promoted brevet major, and quite soon he moved on from the 2nd Division to the headquarters staff as a Deputy Assistant Quartermaster General in the Crimea. So right from the beginning, he's operating as a staff officer in all the relative comfort and security of that particular position. Well, Chelmsford moves on from the Crimea in 1856, and very importantly for him, the Duke of Cambridge is appointed Commander-in-Chief in July of 1856. Now, Cambridge is going to be enormously important in Thesiger's life. As a patron, as a friend of his family, as a political ally, as a defender, as somebody who pushed his career forward. So it's enormously important for the young Thesiger having someone like the Duke of Cambridge behind him. And now we enter a somewhat sleazy patch in the story. In 1857, Thesiger purchased promotion to captain and lieutenant colonel in the Grenadier Guards at enormous expense, I might add. Very soon after that, his father became Lord Chancellor in Lord Derby's 2nd administration, and he was created Baron Chelmsford. Not that they had any territorial connection with Chelmsford. Baron Chelmsford took that title because of an enormously successful case he won in the Chelmsford Assizes in the course of his career. So to commemorate that, he decided to call himself Baron Chelmsford. And the Chelmsfords were never landed in any way, by the way. They never had an estate, they never had a country house. They very much remained in London. But now the young Thesiger's father is in Lord Derby's cabinet. He's a man of enormous influence. And we now come across this rather unorthodox work of jobbery, as it was known at the time, because what young Thesiger did, he wanted to get out of London. Being in the Guards was enormously expensive. Furthermore, the Guards were stationed in London. There was no overseas experience. He wanted the excitement and interest of being in the field. He was inspired by his brother-in-law, Colonel Ingalls, who was one of the heroes of Lucknow. And he managed to exchange from the Grenadier Guards into the 95th or Derbyshire Regiment. Now, this was a very unorthodox step. It's a retrograde step. You're going down from the Grenadier Guards to a line regiment. You're able, in fact, to exchange at the level of lieutenant colonel because of your rank in the Grenadier Guards. So he exchanged as a supernumerary lieutenant colonel, in fact, in the 95th Regiment. And this caused an awful stink, and it was never actually apparently ever done again, this kind of swap. But anyway, Thesiger got what he wanted. In 1858, he joined the 95th Regiment in Central India. He joined the Central India Field Force in the fighting in the Indian Mutiny, and commanded a portion of the force at the Battle of Kundry against some of the rebels. His first taste of action, and it was going to be the only action he had for about another 20 years, in fact. But he succeeded, did very well in that. Well, now he's in India. And here again, patronage plays its part. The 95th was stationed in the Bombay Presidency. And thanks to the patronage of Cambridge and of Sir Hugh Rose, who had been the commander of the Central Indian Field Force and was now commander-in-chief in India, thanks to their patronage, Chelmsford became the Deputy Adjutant General to the British forces in Bombay. So here he is now, in fact, in Bombay, the 95th Regiment, a regimental officer, but also after that a staff officer once again. And in 1863, he becomes a brevet colonel. Then in 1865, another important development, in fact, in terms of his career. Sir Robert Napier was appointed commander-in-chief in the Bombay Presidency. Here is Napier, and there is the young Thesiger, Colonel Thesiger. Napier became very much a personal friend of Thesiger's and very much his patron. And indeed, seeing them cheek by jowl in that photograph in Abyssinia makes the point, because here again they have the movement. Because in 1868, war with Abyssinia breaks out. The Abyssinian field force invades Abyssinia in 1868 under the command of Sir Robert Napier, and he personally selected Colonel Thesiger to be his deputy adjutant general in the Abyssinian campaign. And so there they are together, and Thesiger, in fact, comported himself well. Huge logistical problems conducting that campaign. Thesiger, as a staff officer in control of much of what was going on in transport and so on, did very well and acquitted himself totally to Napier's satisfaction. And Thesiger came out of this campaign with his first order, a CB, Commander of the Bath, as recognition of his services. And also he was made an ADC to Queen Victoria, which certainly sort of added to his luster. Now, his patron, Sir Robert Napier, now Lord Napier of Magdala, was appointed Commander-in-Chief in India. This is in 1870. And once again, he turns to Colonel Thesiger, who is appointed the Adjutant General of the Indian Army, which means he's the Chief of Staff to the Commander-in-Chief. He was a senior administrative officer in India. And this is a position he held for 5 years, the normal term, a very high position in India, a very influential one. There he is with some of his fellow staff officers at that stage. Well, the posting only lasted 5 years. And after that, Chelmsford returned to England, where he took up various home commands. First as a colonel on the staff at Shorncliffe Camp, and then the Brigadier General commanding the 1st Infantry Brigade at Aldershot. In 1877, he was offered the position of Deputy Adjutant General at the Horse Guards, and he turned it down. And this is a pattern in his career, because firstly, he wanted to get back to India. India is where his heart was. India is where he'd really sort of made his life, where he'd made his marriage, where his eldest children were born. It's where he wanted to go back to. Also, being the DAG at the Horse Guards was expensive. And once again, he decided really he couldn't bear the expense of this position. So he turned down this offer. Well, in the normal course of events, he was promoted Major General in 1877, and he was there when there were developments in South Africa. In South Africa, in the Cape Colony, the Ninth Cape Frontier War was being fought. It had broken out in October of that year of 1877, and the general officer commanding in South Africa was General Sir Arthur Cunynghame. And Cunynghame was a perfectly, well, an interesting officer, an interesting man in many ways, but fairly conservative, fairly plodding. But that wasn't the problem. He got into an enormous argument with the Cape colonial government over the deployment and command of the colonial and imperial forces. The colonial The colonial government wanted to control their own forces. Cunynghame said no, he was General Officer Commanding, he really should be in charge of them. And this turned into an awful row, in fact, in the course of which, even though the government came down on the side of Cunynghame, in an effort to placate the Cape colonial government, Cunynghame found himself recalled. Disgraced, he felt, very upset about it all, especially as his troops had just won some major battles and had in fact ended the conventional stage of the Ninth Cape Frontier War. So he was very upset about things. But now we need a replacement. He's recalled in January of 1878. And who replaces him? Well, until 1889, the selection of someone like the General Officer Commanding in South Africa was solely in the hands of Cambridge as Commander-in-Chief, acting through his military secretary, Sir Alfred Horsfield. He also needed the approval, ever since the Cardinal reforms, of the Secretary of State for War, who at that stage was Gaythorne Hardy. So between them, Cambridge and Hardy were going to decide who was going to command in South Africa now that Cunynghame was being recalled. And it's a complex thing. Members of the royal family certainly became involved in this kind of selection. They had their favorites, they exerted their pressure. There were, of course, the famous rings. There was Cambridge's own conservative ring, where General Sir Arthur Ellis, who was the Adjutant General to the forces, was his right-hand man and spokesman in this. He certainly was pushing away at that conservative side of things. Then you've got General Wolsey and his ring, progressive, very much in favor of the Cardinal reforms, thrusting. Cambridge obviously felt him to be quite a threat and disliked him intensely. And then in India, you have General Roberts and his ring, where he was very much against short service, which was part of the Cardinal reforms, which in fact Wolsey was in favor of. So in jockeying for position, in making an appointment to someone like General Officer Commanding, it really, you have all of these different pressures. The Commander-in-Chief, the government, the royal family, and the various rings within the army pushing forward their particular candidates. And it's worth looking at those people who might have gone to South Africa instead of Chelmsford. There was Lieutenant General Sir John Bissett. Now, he had fought in the 6th, 7th, and 8th Cape Frontier Wars, but he was very much a rough diamond. He was felt he was far too tied through marriage and through experience of living, in fact, in the colonies. He's far too much a colonial in that sense. Even more, he was colonel of an Indian regiment of the Indian Army, felt he was not smart enough. And the High Commissioner, Sir Bartle Frere, really felt that you needed somebody of high social and military standing. So you're not going to choose Bissett. Carnarvon, who was the Secretary of State for Colonies, liked Colonel Pomeroy Colley, who was the private secretary to the Viceroy in India. Now, he was considered too junior, and he's also a member of Wolsey's ring, which meant, in fact, he didn't find favor with Cambridge. This is the same Colley, incidentally, who was to make such an absolute mess of the First Anglo-Boer War or Transvaal Rebellion, and who would die at Majuba. Then you had General Sir Daniel Lysons. He was a former AAG at the Horse Guards. He was considered too distinguished. You had Major General Sir Arthur Herbert. Gaythorne Hardy felt he was too lackluster to send out. You had Lieutenant General Sir Patrick MacDougall, who Gaythorne Hardy thought not sufficiently fit for the rigors of South Africa. They succeeded, in fact, for living quite happily in Canada as a General Officer Commanding for many years, but that's by the by. Cambridge rather liked Colonel Glynn, who was Cunningham's second in command in the Cape and had done extremely well in the conventional phase of the war, but he was considered too junior. And then there was Major General Henry Clifford. He had fought in the 7th and 8th Cape Frontier Wars. He was the AAG at the Horse Guards and the ADC to Cambridge. And he was very much the best choice. But in 1878, he was considered too senior and too valuable, in fact, to Cambridge at the Horse Guards. When he was eventually sent out, in fact, in May of 1879 as Chelmsford's minder, if you like, to report back on Chelmsford's progress to Cambridge and to be his successor if, in fact, Chelmsford broke down or was killed or whatever. But that's not the point. So be that as it may, Chelmsford was the ultimate choice, not the first choice, not the top choice, but the choice. And the decision was made on the 24th of January of 1878. He chose his small staff of people he knew rather well. There they are. And off he went now, General Officer Commanding at the Cape of Good Hope, Natal, and St. Helena, with the local rank of Lieutenant General. And the war as it occurred, the war had ended its conventional stage. What you have now is very much kind of guerrilla, irregular warfare, fighting in the bush. Chelmsford tried rather conventional methods of sending in big columns. That didn't work. He learnt, in fact, how to basically parcel out this broken territory into small packets and then to clear each packet bit by bit. And he was finally successful. So this was a campaign which was not conventional, but Chelmsford adapted his normal techniques to be rather effective in this. And the war was certainly over by July of 1878. The Xhosa resistance finally broke down. And Chelmsford was rewarded with a KCB at the end of the campaign. But the next step, no sooner was this campaign over than in August of the same year, 1878, he moved to Pietermaritzburg, set up his headquarters there, because Sir Bartle Frere, the High Commissioner, who was attempting to confederate Southern Africa under the British Crown, saw as part of the deal, eliminating the still independent African states who might pose some kind of military threat to the new confederation. So one by one, these states were to be eliminated, and the first on the list was to be the Zulu kingdom, the most powerful state still surviving as an independent state in Southern Africa. And Frere decided, right, a war must be engineered with the Zulu kingdom, which he proceeded to do, so that it could be wiped out. And the whole idea was that this would be a swift, short, easy campaign, and Chelmsford, as the military arm of the High Commissioner, was quite confident after the relative ease of the campaign in the Eastern Cape that this would certainly be so. Unfortunately, as we all know, this was not the kind of campaign Chelmsford hoped it would be. Here he is with his staff, taken in January on the eve of the war, about to invade the Zulu kingdom, with Colonel Creelock, the military secretary there, and with Lieutenant Barclay Milne, the man with the telescope at his St. Luana. The problem with Chelmsford and his staff, after the easy promenade in the Eastern Cape, they were completely overconfident. They knew the Zulu were supposed to be better fighters than the Xhosa, but on the other hand, they thought the campaign would really be quite easy. And in fact, it proved not to be, as we know. And on the 22nd of January, Chelmsford divided his forces, number 3 column, divided his forces, and the half left in garrison at his camp was overwhelmed by the Zulu at his St. Luana, and Chelmsford fell back in total disarray on Rorke's Drift. Here is a scene of the battlefield the morning after with the disemboweled corpses, and there's Chelmsford and his troops moving off. So this was an absolute disaster, quite unexpected, was never supposed to have happened, and through Sir Bartle Frere into total consternation, and of course everybody at home in Britain as well. Now, Chelmsford had to try and pick up the pieces, and almost a day or two after the battle, he set up a court of inquiry into the defense of the camp. And here we see a rather, well, we can call it almost a kind of sly operation. Chelmsford was determined he was not going to take the blame for this disaster. So the court of inquiry finds that Colonel Durnford was partially responsible for disobeying Chelmsford orders and moving his troops out of camp, too far out of camp. Colonel Pullane, in command of the camp, was found at fault for his faulty dispositions, for moving his infantry too far away from the camp. Other causes were found in the ammunition supply, in the unreliability of the Natal native contingent, and so on. All of these things are deflecting blame from Chelmsford. And it took really a nasty turn a few weeks later when there was an attempt to actually fix the blame on Glynn, who was technically in command of number 3 column, even though Chelmsford was de facto operating as commander, trying to sort of shift the blame onto Glynn for the disaster. So there's all this attempt by Chelmsford to shift the blame onto somebody else. Meanwhile, he himself was in a desperate state. He was really suffered, could only be described as a small nervous breakdown. On the 27th of January, he sent an urgent request to the Horse Guards for reinforcements. Cambridge responded, brought in troops from England, other posts such as Ceylon and so on, and sent out 4 major generals, far too many major generals, all men of his own particular conservative clique, so that in the end, in fact, Chelmsford was overwhelmed with more troops than he actually knew what to do with. But Cambridge did respond to Chelmsford's initial panic. And indeed, Chelmsford was in a bad way, because you find that on the 9th of February, he wrote a letter which he subsequently regretted, and much to his regret became public knowledge, writing to Colonel Stanley, the Secretary of State for War, basically confessing that he was on the verge of a breakdown, that he really just didn't know what to do and he was at his wit's end, which was not something he ought ever to have done. And the result of all of this was that the cabinet met absolutely horrified by what had happened. The country was absolutely astonished as well. The newspapers are full of this, and there were calls for Chelmsford to be recalled. And was Cabinet going to do that? And we find that Cabinet was divided, and not only that, but Queen Victoria and the Prince of Wales both took Chelmsford's side over Santuana, decided to defend him, decided as a general who had done his best, it's really unfair to call him back. So Cabinet basically flinched and didn't actually recall him at that stage. But the Horse Guards were very concerned, and you find on the 6th of March that General Ellis writes to Chelmsford wanting satisfactory answers to many of the questions about the court of inquiry that simply hadn't persuaded the Horse Guards that Chelmsford had told everything about this particular debacle. So you get the cabinet wanting to recall Chelmsford, but stalling. You get the Horse Guards discontented with Chelmsford's explanations and wanting a fuller explanation of what went on. But this is not the end of it. The press, as I say, the public were very aware of this, but Parliament got in on the act. And On the 14th of March, the Liberal MP Edward Jenkins rose in the Commons. He attacked Chelmsford directly for his incompetency, and he put the blame on the Horse Guards and on Cambridge and on court influence. All perfectly correct, in fact. I mean, it's exactly particularly the case, but this is now in the open, highly embarrassing. Cambridge was forced in the House of Lords to rise to defend Chelmsford's record, all very nasty. It's true that the vote of censure in the Commons failed, that the vote of censure on Chelmsford actually failed, but nonetheless, the situation was very bad for Chelmsford, even though the Prince of Wales was still voicing his support for Chelmsford. Chelmsford's reputation in England was particularly poor by this stage. Meanwhile, back in South Africa, Chelmsford was regrouping slowly, and the war took a turn when, not under Chelmsford, but under Colonel Wood, the number 4 column on the western side of Zululand won the Battle of Kambula, which was really on the 29th of March, which really was a turning point of the war, because the men of the Zulu army that had defeated the British at St. Luana marched on Wood's camp at Kambula and were defeated. And this, I say, was a turning point. But at much the same time, Chelmsford had moved forward up the coast to relieve Fort Ashawi, where number 1 column had been blockaded ever since the beginning of the campaign. And at the Battle of Gingeklovo, Chelmsford won a decided victory. This time, lagering his wagons, building sheltered trenches, fighting behind a fixed position, and then finally a mounted pursuit, ending the battle. That Chelmsford, in other words, had learned how to fight and defeat the Zulu by this stage. But the problem with the Battle of Gingeklovo, something else followed, which was going to prove fatal to Chelmsford. All right, the Battle of Gingeklovo and the Battle of Kambula were both celebrated in Britain. It seemed the war had turned. But here is a problem. On the 11th of March, Chelmsford had held a meeting at Pinetown with the Lieutenant Governor of Natal, Sir Henry Bulwer. And this was the issue over the deployment of African levies raised in the colony. Chelmsford wanted an active defense. He didn't want these levies simply to sit on the Natal side of the border. He wanted them, in fact, to raid into Zululand, and diversions in favor of the British columns inside the country. Bulwer, who did not want to bring Zulu vengeance down on Natal, was very much against this. And at Pinetown on the 11th of March, they apparently agreed that the levies would not be used in the active defense in Zululand. But straight after the Battle of Gingeklovo on the 8th and 9th of April, that's exactly what happened. There were transporter raids on Chelmsford's orders over the Tugela River into Zululand, where various huts were burnt and that kind of thing. And Bulwer was incandescent over this, and a correspondence now ensued. A correspondence that is thick as a book, with Bulwer attacking Chelmsford, Chelmsford defending himself, the whole business over the deployment of who is in command of the troops in the field. Exactly the debate that Cunynghame had had with the Cape government back in 1877, 1878. And here it is all over again. And both of them, both Chelmsford and Bulwer, are writing voluminous dispatches to the Secretary of State for Colonies, complaining about each other's performance. Meanwhile, back in Britain, Chelmsford seemed very slow getting his second invasion of Zululand off the ground. Things weren't moving very fast. And at this stage, Colonel Stanley thought, really, we've got to do something about this. And in mid-April, he summoned General Wolseley. Now, Wolseley had, since the middle of 1878, he'd been High Commissioner and Governor General of Cyprus, which had been ceded the Convention of June 1878 to Britain by the Ottoman Turks. Wolsey certainly wasn't happy at all sitting in Cyprus, and he was only too pleased to be called back to London, not technically to be Chelmsford's replacement, but for Stanley to discuss certain military matters with him. It's a ruse, basically. You've got Wolsey back in London. Then, on the 1st of May, Chelmsford's letter of the 19th of March, which he had written in response to the Horse Guards' demand for further elucidation of what happened at Isantawana, his letter arrived. It didn't satisfy Cambridge at all, and Cambridge absolutely thought, no, this simply will not do. And a few days later, both Stanley and Cambridge wrote to Chelmsford, criticizing the operations, criticizing the fact that he was now invading Zululand with two separate columns deployed too far apart to make any kind of contact or mutual support for each other, attacking him for failing to produce detailed plans for the rest of the campaign, complaining that in fact this campaign was grinding on and on so tremendously slowly, in fact, that there seemed to be no way of bringing it to an end. And here is a model of a modern Major General in London, waiting in the wings. So while Stanley and Cambridge are furious with Chelmsford's conduct of the campaign and the slow pace it's going, Hicks Beach, the colonial secretary, had all this correspondence from Bulwer and Chelmsford landing on his desk. And this was simply the last straw. This kind of issue was a repetition of the Cunynghame thing, and simply they didn't want it. Once again, true, the British government came down on Chelmsford's side and said, yes, he could command all the forces in the field and do with them as he wished. But nonetheless, this was just the final straw. And the cabinet met between the 19th and 23rd of May, 3 cabinet meetings to decide what to do with Chelmsford. At first, he had some support, but that slowly withered away. And the decision was to have a single unified civil and military command in Southern Africa. Now, Cabinet also decided they would not recall Chelmsford as Cunynghame had been recalled. He was not going to suffer that disgrace. But what they were going to do is supersede him by putting an officer over him, in fact. And Cambridge, when confronted by the decision of Cabinet, agreed to this. And he put forward Lord Napier, Chelmsford's old patron and commander-in-chief of India, to be the new supremo in South Africa, instead of Wolsey. I mean, didn't want Wolsey, disliking his ring so much. But fortunately for everybody, Napier made himself unavailable. So Wolsey had to be. Cambridge didn't like it. He complained bitterly. The Queen was highly annoyed as well, but Wolsey it was. And on 26th of May, Wolsey officially superseded Chelmsford. And he was now to be High Commissioner in Southeastern Africa, taking that area away from Sir Bartle Frere. He was to be Governor of the Transvaal, taking that out of Sir Bartle Frere's hands as well. He was to be Governor of Natal, which put him over the Lieutenant Governor, Sir Henry Bulwer. And he was to be Commander-in-Chief and with the local rank of General, which put him, in fact, over Chelmsford as a higher officer. So this is it. On the 28th of May, Hicks Beach telegraphed Frere and Bulwer that they had been superseded by Wolsey, and Stanley telegraphed Chelmsford to the same effect. And the following day, the 29th, wrote him an official letter to be sent to South Africa, informing him that he'd been superseded. Now, the thing about Chelmsford is he's not really going to take this lying down. He is slowly, very slowly on the move. You can see all his ox wagons and cattle, and it's a very slow process. Life hasn't been easy for Chelmsford. The Prince Imperial managed to get himself ambushed and killed, which caused another furore in England, and once again Chelmsford found himself in the limelight just as he didn't want. So he's marching slowly towards Ondini, Echuaya's capital, for the final confrontation of the war, when on the 16th of June, he gets the telegram from Stanley, the telegram the 28th of May, telling him he had been superseded. But Chelmsford looked and said, "Oh, this is just a telegram, it's not an official letter. I'm going to ignore it." So he ignores it, and he still continues to act as if he were general officer commanding. But what it did do, it put a rocket under Chelmsford, that his slow advance on Ondini suddenly doubled in speed, because Chelmsford now realized that he was going to be superseded, even if he refused really to accept it. He realized he was going to lose his position, and he was determined to win his decisive battle to recoup his reputation before it was too late. So now, thanks to the threat of being superseded, the advance on Ulundi speeds up enormously. Meanwhile, Wolsey is sailing to South Africa, and this takes time. He left England on the 28th of May. He finally got to Port Elizabeth in the Eastern Cape on the 26th of June, and from there he telegraphed Chelmsford, informing him that he was subordinated to his command. 2 days later, Wolsey arrived in Durban, and he telegraphed Chelmsford again, ordering him to concentrate the 1st and 2nd Divisions to bring these two disparate forces together into one single overwhelming force. Well, Chelmsford received Wolsey's telegram from Port Elizabeth that same day on the 28th, and he replied disingenuously, "Oh, well, he was advancing and he would retire after he had won an engagement. He would retire for supply once he'd won his battle." So he's basically answering Wolsey, but actually not obeying his instructions. And on the 1st of July, Wolsey again telegraphed Chelmsford to retire and to concentrate, which in fact was really quite a daft command, in fact, because Chelmsford was in sight by this stage of Ondini. And Chelmsford once again ignored Wolsey's orders to concentrate, retire, and all the rest of it. Wolsey, realizing Chelmsford was not obeying him, was desperate to get to the front, and he went by sea from Durban to Port Durnford on the east coast, where the 1st Division was encamped. The problem is Port Durnford wasn't a port at all. It's simply a beach and a roadstead outside, and the weather was appalling. And Wolsey, for 2 days, tried to land by lighter on the coast. The weather was too rough, and he had, in fact, to sail back to Durban without being able to land, which gave Chelmsford the moment he had been waiting for. And on the 4th of July, he won his great battle of Ulundi, which he hoped would restore his reputation and end the war. The day after the battle, on the 5th of July, he finally received Stanley's letter of the 29th of May, his letter formally informing him that he was superseded. There was no dodging this one. This was not a telegram, this was a letter signed by the Secretary of State. Well, Chelmsford again dithered. The next day, he wrote to Stanley and Cambridge asking permission to resign and continuing to act as General Officer Commanding in the interim. But Wolsey wasn't having this, and he sent Chelmsford his General Order number 62, confirming his supersession putting down in black and white, which Chelmsford could not ignore, that in fact he was now to command only the 2nd Division and the flying column, that the 1st Division he was no longer in command of, and that Wolsey was his superior officer. And upon this, Chelmsford could no longer duck and dive, and he resigned his command on the 9th of July, rather than take up this inferior command. And he withdrew. He met Wolsey at St. Paul's on the 15th of July, a very difficult meeting to say the least. He lost his rank as well, his temporary rank of Lieutenant General. He reverted to Major General, but he found, to his surprise, both in Durban and in Pietermaritzburg and in Cape Town, the colonists decided he was a hero, that wherever he went, he was greeted as a conquering hero, banquets and processions and triumphal arches and all the rest of it. So Chelmsford was able to leave South Africa feeling that in fact he had been vindicated. And he felt that his victory had in fact at last rubbed away the stain of his St. Luana. And there's this famous cartoon of Disraeli cleaning his boots. The war is over. And when Chelmsford arrived at Southampton, and no, not at Southampton, at Plymouth, the Prince of Wales was there on the dock, on the quayside, waiting to greet him, and had written him anyway a letter of congratulation on Ulundi, as had other people. So Chelmsford arrived home. He thought as a hero, royal approbation. He thought his record, in fact, had been cleared. But this wasn't the case at all. Because when he arrived, he received a letter by Major General Ellis, the AG at the War Office, written on behalf of Cambridge, an official letter saying that, as far as St. Luana was concerned, Chelmsford was at fault. No good trying to put it on Durnford or Pullein or whoever else. That what was wrong was his poor strategy. He had not sufficiently concentrated his forces. That he had unwisely divided number 3 column in the face of the enemy. That he had not conducted adequate reconnaissance, and that he had set up no proper defense for the camp. In other words, the Horse Guards had decided that the fault of his St. Luana lay squarely on Chelmsford's shoulders, and that really effectively was going to end his career. Disraeli also forced in a way to greet him as a conquering hero, nonetheless was having nothing to do with him, because as far as he was concerned, he had brought his whole government into disrepute and cost £5 million, over a long campaign that should have been over in a week. But the situation not quite as simple as that, because Disraeli feels he has to award Chelmsford with the GCB, which Chelmsford receives at the Queen's hands at Balmoral. So he goes off to Balmoral, he's invested with the GCB. Queen Victoria is very sympathetic, meets Chelmsford, talks to Chelmsford, spends several days with him, wants photographs of his wife and all the rest of it. So Queen Victoria, now having supported him, if you like, previously in principle, is now supporting him because she likes the man. And indeed, he is a very charming fellow. So there it is, Chelmsford. The Horse Guards have really finished with him. The Queen still likes him, but it's not over yet either, because in August and early September of the following year, Chelmsford's old patron, Sir Hugh Rose, back from the days of the Bombay Presidency and India, now is Field Marshal Lord Strathnairn, who, as a matter of principle, felt that Chelmsford should not be allowed to get away from it, and brought up the matter of his St. Luana yet again in the House of Lords in 2 grueling sessions, where Chelmsford defended himself as best he could, not altogether successfully, and by the end of the session, certainly, he was left with considerable egg on his face once again. He defended his record valiantly, but it is so patently obvious the fault of his St. Luana lay with him. So now here is Chelmsford, back again as a Major General. What does he do with his life? Well, in 1880, he was offered command of the Western District at Devonport. But once again, Chelmsford felt that Devonport was far too expensive. You'd be having to entertain naval personnel and visiting dignitaries and all the rest of it. He couldn't afford it, and he still wanted India. He wanted desperately to get back to India. He makes further requests for employment, but here's the problem. The Tories are now out of power. Disraeli loses the election in April of 1880. You now have Gladstone's second administration, and as far as they're concerned, Chelmsford is an embarrassment and a liability, and they were not going to employ him. And finally, in fact, in 1884, in fact, the Duke of Cambridge wrote to Queen Victoria saying, listen, Chelmsford is never again going to have a command. Don't try and think of it, don't push him. He is definitely on the shelf. Well, the army being the army, Chelmsford, of course, continues through seniority to be promoted. Lieutenant General in 1882, full general in 1888, until he's finally put on the retirement list, retired list in 1893. But that's not yet the end of the story, because there's a royal safety net, if you like. As we know, the Queen likes him. As we know, the Queen has supported him, and Chelmsford enters a new life as a courtier, and there are family connections here. His widowed sister, Mary Thesiger, no, not his widow, I mean his unmarried sister, Mary Thesiger, was lady-in-waiting to the Duchess of Teck, and the Duchess of Teck was a daughter of the Duke of Cambridge. Connections. His widowed sister, Julia Ingalls, whose husband had been the hero of Lucknow, she was the housekeeper of the state apartments at St. James's Palace. And not only that, Chelmsford's fourth son, Eric, was appointed a page of honor by Queen Victoria in 1884. And not only that, in the same year, 1884, the Queen appointed Chelmsford Lieutenant of the Tower. That was in her gift. The Lieutenancy of the Tower was in her gift, and to Chelmsford she gave it. And this even yet wasn't the end of it, because in 1900, Chelmsford, since 1889, had been the honorary colonel of the Sherwood Foresters, formerly the 95th Regiment. But he exchanged that year into the 2nd Life Guards, as colonel of the 2nd Life Guards, and was appointed by Queen Victoria Gold Stick in waiting, as we see him there in the uniform as Gold Stick. And when she died the following year, the position was renewed by King Edward VII. So Chelmsford remained, in fact, Gold Stick in waiting under Edward VII. And in 1902, he was made a GCVO, Grand Cross of the Victorian Order. This again was the gift of the sovereign, and Edward VII invested him with this particular order. So here we have him full of honors, a royal courtier, is St. Luana not forgiven, but more or less forgotten, and dying, in fact, in the United Service Club while playing billiards, or at least having a stroke while playing billiards, and dying the next day in 1905. And at his funeral, you find the king himself, Edward VII, was at his funeral, as was his brother, the Duke of Connaught, who was Inspector General to the forces. So right to the very end, Chelmsford, if you like, title, patronage, privilege, royal approval, managed to trump a rather lackluster and in many ways disastrous military career. And he ended up, as I say, full of highest rank and vested in honors. So that's where we leave him, and I'll now answer whatever questions there might be.
Thank you very much indeed, John. Always fascinating to learn more about Victorian generals and the Victorian army in general, in fact. Thesiger comes across as a, I don't know, to me at least, from your descriptions, as a fairly lackluster, weak character, or was he quite determined in the way he dealt with people?
Well, it's quite interesting. I mean, he was obviously a very nice man. People liked him. He was a very devout Christian, very involved in that, very concerned with the well-being of his troops, very concerned with the education of troops. He played a musical instrument. He was a good family man, and he was undoubtedly a very good administrator. I mean, he'd done very well in Abyssinia and India. He knew what he was doing there, and in fact, even in the Ninth Cape Frontier War, he learned quickly enough to abandon his very conventional sending in of columns and all the rest of it to try proper, really counterinsurgency operations, if you like. I mean, he learned that quickly enough. And in a sense, in the Anglo-Zulu War as well, after the disaster at Santa Juana, which I might say the which followed very much in the way the troops were set out, the dispositions that particular day, of the kind of dispositions you had seen in the Ninth Cape Frontier War. Skirmishing lines with supports, with artillery support, cavalry on the wing, etc., etc. That is how the wars have been battled and been fought in the Eastern Cape. So that in itself was not unusual. But he had learnt from Rorke's Drift that the only really effective way to defeat the Zulu was to form an all-round position, whether a wagon lager as at Gingingclovo or an infantry square at Ulundi. So he was certainly open to innovation if necessary. And himself, he was a very keen reader. I mean, where other officers were roistering, he was reading much of the time. So, I mean, it's a situation of somebody who was lackluster and, in fact, too much. He had to arrange everything himself. He was bad at delegating. He was rushing around the field. I mean, part of the problem of the Santa Juana, he was lost for half the day because he had to go and see it himself rather than sending it off to his subordinates and coordinating it, you know, from a set spot. So I mean, these are the problems. There is this element of trying to get out. I mean, the whole business of trying to get out of the responsibility for Santa Juana, it wasn't straightforward. And his response to Wolsey's commands to, you know, concentrate and retire and all the rest of it, that wasn't straightforward either. That he was determined to have his own way. And when he really wanted to, as you could see, this spurt on he got when he realized he's going to be superseded, and the determination to win his battle. So there is quite a strong sort of element there as well. And it's interesting when you hear him defend himself, when you read Hansard reports of his defense when he was taken apart by Lord Strathnairn. I mean, very determined, not phased, not backing down, you know, a man of courage indeed. And there's no doubting enormous courage under fire always, whether it couldn't drive back in the Indian Mutiny or the Battle of Ulundi. I mean, he was there, never one to duck, so to speak.
Great. Neil's asked the obvious question: did Chelmsford receive any professional grounding in either staff work or command, perhaps at the Staff College in Quetta or Cambridge?
No, absolutely not. You know, it was Wolsey who much preferred his staff officers to be, in fact, you know, had been to Staff College and all the rest of it. Chelmsford was very much of the Cambridge school in the sense that you had this You weren't sure about officers who'd gone to Self College. They're sort of, evading the proper officering in the field and all of that kind of thing. And he himself had absolutely no special training as such, except what, of course, he had learnt in practice as an ADC, as an AG, and all the rest of it. So, he'd learnt on the job, so to speak. But his intelligence gathering was never quite perhaps as expert as it should be. So that is certainly a problem, I think. Yeah.
Was he? Did he have an ability to? If he was lacking in his own ability, perhaps, perhaps
Mm.
not self-confidence, but did he? Was he able to pick subordinates that were able to support him? I mean, in the case of his staff in this campaign,
Mm.
were they good?
No, not really. That's the other problem. I mean, he chose people like Colonel Creelock had also been in the 95th. Other officers he had known, Aldershot, etc. I mean, these were solid people, but they weren't particularly good. He simply knew them, liked them, and felt he could work with them. And you find that certainly during his nervous breakdown stage, he was very dependent on Colonel Wood and Colonel Buller up there on the western side, number 4 column, who in Zululand itself and remained in Zululand, sort of harrying the Zulus. So that, I mean, if you got all these letters, I'm depending on you. What should I do? If it weren't for you, etc., etc. So there is that sort of side to him. But that was during his nervous breakdown after Santa Juana. When he recovered his confidence, he was going to do it his way. So the latter stage of the campaign, he is very much his own man and not listening to anyone else.
You gave us a very clear exposition of the various political rings, etc., that Cambridge,
Yeah. Mm.
Wolseley, Roberts, but we
Yeah.
didn't mention Roberts very much. Roberts, of course, being in India,
India.
India
Yeah.
is where he wants to go. So you've
Mm.
explained to us that Chelmsford was part of the Cambridge ring, if you like.
Yeah.
Did he also
Mm.
find himself overlapping with Roberts's ring?
Well, in that sense, yes, because um, when you get to the cardinal reforms and certainly to short service, which Wolsey was so keen on, Chelmsford and Cambridge and Roberts were very much of the same way of thinking in that. So yeah, I mean, so you do get that particular overlap there, and so really, I suppose you get Roberts, if you like, in conflict with Wolsey, but also Wolsey in conflict with Chelmsford and Cambridge. So it's Wolsey, the hard done by Wolsey, whom nobody appreciated. So he thought, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Everything's a garnet.
Awesome.
John,
Yeah,
John, thank you very much indeed for your talk this
no,
evening.
sure.
It's been much
My
appreciated.
pleasure.
If you
Great.
open up the chat box in the way that I showed you, you can see the comments are flowing in there of people that
Right.
have both enjoyed the talk and are
Good.
determined to buy your book. So that's
Good.
always
Well, that's always good, isn't it?
always
Yeah.
good.
Yeah.
Um,
Good.
Before I close down the session, having thanked
Mm,
John for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk, just a reminder that the next talk in May, the sign up is there at the bottom of your screen if you haven't already
mm,
clicked on the link.
mm,
If you want to buy John's book, you can go up to the handouts tab at the top of the chat box, click on that and find the download button.
mm,
But for now, I'm going to, on behalf of the Society, thank John for a final time and
mm.
the audience, and see you all next month. Thank you, John.
Well, thank you very much. I enjoyed that. Thank you.